think on that note of the failure of biennales to be politically specific, I think is a very important note to end on, and maybe something that we can pick up again later as well when we start to talk about the contemporary, because I think in many ways the absence of the political in terms of the contemporary discourse is something that makes a radical distinction, and it's something that we have referred to, I think, in Boris's talk and also now in Peter's in very interesting ways. But nevertheless, I think there are certain strategies for a kind of politicization, and I'm looking now at Anton in a certain way, a kind of politicization or potential politicization in being an artist. What we've tried to do in this talk is to mix the voice of the theorist with those multi-syllable words with the voices of artists who I think can have another kind of register. And I think it's important that within a museum that these mixtures can actually happen and be understood to be not necessarily equivalent, but be offering different lenses, different tropes through which to analyze the same kinds of histories. Anton Vidokle, who's our next speaker, was born in Moscow and moved to the US with his parents in 1981 as a small child. His work as an artist has been widely exhibited in shows including biennials in Venice, Lyon, Dakar, and Łódź, all those biennials that looked at constructing the material of the world without politically directing it, as well as at the Tate Modern in London, which I don't know what the ideological framework Peter would put on the Tate Modern in London, but I presume it has one, although they denied it once in a talk. Anton, as well as this artistic practice, and this is, I think, which is very interesting, and I hope you're going to be able to talk a little bit about it, is the founding director of eFlux, which many of you might receive every few minutes in your emails, and has produced within the context of eFlux, so as well as this framework for distributing information, which has been incredibly successful. If we think about the world without eFlux, I think it's hard to imagine what the art world would be in some senses. But has produced projects within that framework, including the next documenter should be curated by an artist. That was before the last documenter, actually. Do It, an image bank for everyday revolutionary life, and the Martha Rossler Library, which has been a library of a single artist, which has been touring the world, effectively, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years. As well as this, Anton, together with his colleagues, produced the eFlux Journal, which is an online journal, but it does also exist as a printed version, of which I have one here. And these will also be in the library. But you can read all the articles here on the website as well, I think. They're all freely available. So, again, a lot of background reading material available in eFlux. And there's an interesting recent issue which has been produced by Irit Rogov, who many of you will know from the Academy exhibition that we did here some 3 years ago. And to some extent, the Academy exhibition is the beginning of this latest version of the eFlux Journal, which looks at education in general. As well as, so returning to education, Vidokle himself initiated an idea of research into education as a site for artistic practice. So education as a site for artistic practice and how to research this as co-curator, so performing another function as an artist, of Manifesta 6, which was intended to be in Cyprus some 4 years ago, I think now, and was cancelled because of political difficulties with the division of the island. In response to the cancellation, Vidokle and others set up an independent project in Berlin called United Nations Plaza, a 12-month project involving more than 100 artists, writers, philosophers, and diverse audiences coming together and kind of organizing a temporary, almost spontaneous art school, in a sense, in Berlin. So, Anton, the stage is yours. Thanks very much.
So, I will read a text I wrote for this, and also there will be some visual material in the background. It's a raw footage shot in New York a couple of years ago. Interesting, there's no image. Let's see what we can do. Okay, here we go. Let's give it. So first I want to thank Boris and Charles and Maria for inviting me to come. It's always a pleasure to come to Van Abbe. So just a couple of things. I mean, this is I just recently started thinking about this largely because of Boris's invitation about this topic that I'm writing a paper on right now. So a lot of these ideas are quite new for me, and I'm still kind of working them out. So this is a bit of a work in process. Boris Groys asked me to speak about social artistic projects and a certain identification between art and everyday life as it pertains to current art practices. One of the ideas I would like to pursue in this conversation concerns a certain desire not to work, or more precisely, not to work in the capacity of an artist. Recently, I recalled the precise moment when it first occurred to me that I would like to become an artist. I grew up in Moscow, and my father was a self-taught musician working at the circus. Circus artists work extremely hard physically. The amount of daily practice and physical exercise necessary to perform acrobatic acts or walk a tightrope is really enormous. Basically, they practice and exercise all day and perform at night. It's nearly a 24-hour job. Slow down, too fast? Okay. So there was this birthday party for one of the kids in the building I lived in, which belonged to the Union of Circus Artists. All of us were at this party were maybe 5 or 6 years old, children of clowns, animal trainers, and so forth. At some point, the conversation started about what we wanted to be when we grow up. And following the usual things like a cosmonaut or a fireman, one of the kids said that he wanted to be a fine artist, explaining that this is because they do not work. I was very shy as a kid, so I didn't really say much, but thought to myself that this boy is really smart, and I too do not want to work and should therefore try to become an artist. Ironically, this momentary realization ultimately pointed me on a trajectory that led to a perpetual state of work for many years. While my classmates in school tended to just hang out or play sports after classes, I went to drawing lessons every night. When my family moved to America, I enrolled in 3 schools simultaneously: School of Visual Art by day, Art Students League classes by night, and collective drawing lessons on weekends. I also had a part-time job decorating shop windows, so it was a pretty busy period. Since the early 20th century, much of advanced analysis of art production refers to the position of the artist and the intellectual as cultural workers. I think that it's probably seemed advantageous and desirable to see yourself and have others perceive you as a member of the most dynamic class, a class that was expected to dominate the making of history, the working class. While rereading the Communist Manifesto some time ago, it was interesting to note how sure Marx was that the middle class, from which the majority of cultural producers actually come from, is merely a small and historically insignificant group that is destined to vanish during the final confrontation between bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a battle from which the proletariat was expected to emerge victorious. So what progressive agent of culture would want to belong to this vanishing species? To this day, many in the field of contemporary art insist on the usage of the term cultural producer, a term that now supposedly blurs differences between different members of the art industry, artists, curators, critics, administrators, and patrons of art, on the assumption that we are all working together to produce meaning and culture. Much of this language and thinking is predicated on the privileged position of work, that in order for art to come into being, work needs to be done. Hard work, important work, work of art, artwork. While there is a lot of disagreement about what type of work is actually required, who should do it, or if and how they should be trained for it, it is rarely questioned whether the work is actually necessary or essential to production of art. Duchamp mused if there could be a work not of art, but can there also be an art without work? Certainly making art objects requires labor and work, but art does not exclusively belong to the realm of objects. It seems to me that art largely resides within and in between subjects, and the subject does not require work to produce him or herself. Falling in love, having a religious or aesthetic experience does not require work. So why should art require work to come into being? It would be useful here to refer to distinctions that Hannah Arendt draws between labor, work, and action. For Arendt, labor corresponds to a basic need for human life to sustain itself, such as farming, preparation of food, etc. Work goes beyond satisfaction of immediate needs and corresponds to human ability to build and maintain a world fit for human use, while action is the only activity, and this is a quote from her, is the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things and matter, and corresponds to the human condition of plurality. I suppose Arendt's understanding of this was inspired by the ancient Greeks, who, unlike Marxists, frowned on the idea of work. Labor was for slaves. Free citizens were expected to engage in politics, not work. The only type of occupation not looked down upon apparently was that of a shepherd, presumably because when one walks around in the fields with animals, one is fully present, yet is not occupied, and is free to think. While I'm not completely sure that action, in Arendt's beautiful definition, is always applicable to describing conditions that enable production of art, I suspect that certain type of art practices can turn labor and work into action, and in doing so, free art from a dependence on labor and work. Historically, there has been many different approaches to realizing this, yet all seem to converge around the concern with conditions of production. If art is produced as an outcome of certain conditions, rather than, let's say, an act of genius which is not interesting or possible to discuss, then creating such conditions would actually produce art. If ultimate conditions of production are world and life, rather than a studio or an art museum, it would then follow that a certain way of living, of being in the world, would in itself result in production of art. No work is necessary. I believe that the concern with such interdependence between art and life and the state of the subject therein was very much the preoccupation of the many avant-garde artists, and particularly among the Russian avant-garde. It seems to me that the thinking at the time was not only that the production of a new way of life would result in a production of groundbreaking revolutionary art, but also the other way around, that the production of a new type of art would result in a new way of life and in turn a new subject. A good example of this would be the Left magazine, co-published by Rodchenko and others, the explicit stated goal of which was to produce such a new subject through exposing its readers to a new content and form, to new art. This winter I spent a lot of time looking at Warhol's films from around the mid-1960s. What is really fascinating is the complex structure he put in place for production of these films. While Warhol's silkscreen paintings from this period gather most attention from art historians, in part because they are expensive objects in museum and private collections, it seems to me that he basically had them made to fund the production of films, which were very expensive to make but produced no income. He is very blunt about this in his interviews from the period. Not only are the paintings and objects physically made by studio assistants, even their subject matter is determined by others. Okay, but then it's tempting to understand this simply as a situation where someone does some money work to fund the production of the real work, the films. Yet Warhol's involvement in the films is not very different. The screenplays are written by someone else. He does not direct the actors or shoot them or edit the films. The set for most part is his studio, as is the factory. One of my personal favorites is a film called The Couch, in which, according to Gerard Malanga, who found the red couch on the street and brought it to the factory, every time other activities at the factory were finished or exhausted, someone would just start filming the couch, including whatever activity was taking place at the moment, conversations, eating, sex, and so forth. Furthermore, the films do not seem to be made to be watched in their entirety, which is something that would be very hard for most filmmakers to accept. You want the audience to see the totality of your work, no matter how experimental. It is very frustrating when people stop paying attention and leave midway through the piece. Yet the majority of Warhol's films seem to have a built-in indifference to this, which is, I think, something related to what Boris was alluding to yesterday when he spoke of what makes reduction possible. In one of the interviews I saw from 1966, Warhol says point blank that he has not worked in 3 years and is not working at the time of this interview. It's easy to assume that this is another evasive maneuver or a provocation that he was so good at during interviews, Yet it seems to me that he was actually being very direct. Having created conditions, certain conditions for production, he was present, yet he didn't need to work in order for a really significant art to come into being. It also seems to me that the most important mechanism of the factory, the central activity there, was not so much the production of art objects or films, but production of very particular social relations, a new lifestyle which in turn resulted in films and all other things. Warhol, the proponent of business art, may seem to be artistically far from the idealist or utopian early avant-garde, but actually he was using very similar structures. A different approach to not working can be found in the artistic practice of Rick Ravania, with who I have collaborated on a number of occasions. A couple of years ago, we did something in New York which involved turning E-Flux storefront into a kind of a free diner discussion space where 3 days of conversations on contemporary art took place during lunch and dinner sessions. The conversations were subsequently transcribed, edited, and published as an issue of A Prior magazine. While there were a number of specially invited speakers, the conversations were actually open to participation from anyone from free-floating public attending this event. Cooking was done largely by Rikrit with some help from his assistants and friends. I suppose inviting the public to participate in cooking would have been a little bit risky. To be honest, I never noticed how much Rikrit actually works when he does this cooking thing for large amounts of people. Each of the 3 days started early, around 7 or 8 in the morning with shopping for food. Cooking started around 11 to be ready in time for the lunch session, followed by a couple of hours of cleaning. Then the shopping again for dinner, because we don't have a refrigerator at the office and it's quite hot in New York. Cooking and cleaning again until around midnight. Not being in a real restaurant or an apartment makes cooking, washing, cleaning very labor-intensive. On the other hand, spending most of his time in an improvised kitchen in our backyard allowed Rikrit not to engage in the conversation and not to speak or answer questions about his art, which is something I think he does not like to do. When asked if what he was doing is art, Rikrit said no, he's just cooking. I think what happens here is that rather than speak or work in the capacity of an artist, Rikrit prefers to make himself very busy doing something else in the space of art. And, for example, simple analogies, when I was trying to write this paper, I immediately, started cleaning my apartment, washing dishes, watering plants. I even went and got a haircut, anything to not work in the capacity that required to produce this. Furthermore, not unlike the factory, yet dispersed amidst many different art venues and dates, Rikrit's activity manages to temporarily construct rather peculiar sets of social relations between those in attendance. While he displaces the art object and the figure of the artist from its traditional center stage, literally to the kitchen, his presence usually forms a quiet yet an influential and shaping center for those present. Rikrit does manage to produce art while not working in the capacity of an artist. Yet to do so, he really makes himself very busy. He works very hard doing something else. How are we doing on time? Yeah? Okay. An artist today can aspire to a certain kind of sovereignty. This means that unlike artists who worked, let's say, before French Revolution, at least in theory, we can decide what kind of practice do we want to have, what subject matter is important to us, what is it that we decide to do, and not merely to satisfy a commission or a patron or a client, but to follow our internal self-interest or interest in response to or respond to urgent events. This feels so natural now, yet only a few hundred years ago this type of position was pretty much inconceivable. It's important to keep in mind that a possibility of such sovereignty did not just happen by itself, but was a result of a long struggle for independence from the church, from the aristocracy, from public taste, from critics, and so on. However, the sovereignty does not exist in a vacuum. It is perpetually being contained by the institutions of art, the market, the critical establishment. So while as an artist you may think that you're free to do what you want in order for it to be economically sustainable, critically acknowledged, or just even to bring it in contact with an art public, it needs to conform to a certain network, network protocols that dictate what sort of art production could enter the network. If an artist was to develop a kind of a practice requiring new institutional configuration in order to manifest itself, it would mean that in addition to producing art, one also has to produce the conditions that enable such production and its circulation. The production of these conditions can become so critical to the production of art that it can assume the shape of art itself. I'm often asked why I did not speak very much at the United Nations Plaza, or why I did not organize my own seminar for its programs. In retrospect, I think in part this was because I wanted to be one of the students. I did not want to work. The other reason is something like when you cook for people, sometimes you don't really want to eat yourself. I think throughout UNP I was very preoccupied with the production of conditions for all of this activity to take place that made my direct participation in the capacity of an artist unnecessary. Before I started this project, I remember coming to visit Boris in Cologne, where we took a walk in one of the beautiful parks that form a kind of a ring throughout the city. We spoke about plans for this experimental school in Berlin, and Boris suggested, half in jest, that the ultimate goal should be probably the production of a new public subject. Although it is impossible to measure or confirm that such a thing took place, I do think that certain transformations have occurred. In many respects, my practice is not unique and follows a certain historical tradition, which can also be observed in activities of other artists today. Martha Rossler's If You Lived Here began as an immediate response to a certain attempt at institutional containment of an exhibition of her work that she was invited to do, and became one of her most influential projects, in part due to lack of support Rossler received from the Dia Foundation, who commissioned the project. She felt that the only way to do an art project there was by repositioning herself as a curator-organizer, a kind of a one-person institution rather than an individual artist. She chose to work at Dia in another capacity. This resulted in a complex 3-month project comprised of several exhibitions on housing and homelessness, involving numbers of artists, architects, activists, community groups, a series of public discussions, and a book, while being at the same time a seminal artwork by Rossler that influenced several generations of artists such as Rick Ritter-Vanier, René Green, and Liam Gillick, and many others. We're coming to the end. What passed largely unnoticed in Paul Chan's production of Waiting for Godot in New Orleans was Chan's peculiar positioning of the artist in relation to his art. He did not write the play. He did not act in it. The set was essentially city street. However, I would argue that Chan's artistic involvement consisted largely of spending many months as a volunteer teacher in a local college, building close relationships with local community groups and grassroots organizations, making sure that part of the money raised for the project would go to urgent local needs other than culture. In other words, creating conditions for production and reception of the play. While these types of projects are not entirely free from collaboration with existing institutions of art, they do manage to assert a degree of sovereignty, in part by assuming curatorial and organizational methodologies, and often in combination with discursive and collective modes of production. They do so also in part by shifting the activity of an artist to work in another capacity, through a refusal to perform the artist's work. Once I overheard someone ask Rickrit about what I do as an artist. He considered the question for a few moments and then said that I don't do anything, that basically I make myself present. If this is true, then my childhood dream has been fully realized. I am an artist and I don't work. Thanks very much.